May 8, 1943. A B-17 flying fortress named Fightin, Swede is limping across the skies of New Guinea with one mission: locate a Japanese convoy and report back. The pilot's name is Robert Keatts. He's 23 years old. Experienced. He's done this 100 times. At 9 a.m. he makes his last radio transmission. Static crackles. His voice comes through clear. We've located a convoy, 50 miles north of Madang. We're circling, reporting position now. That transmission goes out to base. Other pilots hear it. The radio operator writes it down. Headquarters notes the time. Then, nothing. The Fightin Swede never transmits again. It never lands. It never returns to base. All that's left is a mystery, a Japanese propaganda broadcast, and the deathbed testimonies of men who almost brought a crippled bomber home against impossible odds. But here's what we didn't know for decades. The reason those men never made it home wasn't a mechanical failure or flak. It was a deliberate act of war that changed forever the question of honor in combat. This is the story of a ramming attack nobody expected, a pilot who thought he was going to die, and the last words spoken in an American cockpit over 18,000 feet in the air. To understand what happened on May 8th, you need to understand the desperate situation the Americans faced in the spring of 1943. The war in the Pacific was going badly. Japan had been unstoppable for months. They controlled vast stretches of ocean and island territory. American forces were being pushed back. Supply lines were being strangled. The Japanese Navy still ruled these waters. Intelligence reports reaching Port Moresby in early May indicated something critical. Japanese merchant ships, supply vessels, were converging on the northern coast of New Guinea, Madang specifically. If those ships made it through, they would resupply Japanese positions that were threatening the entire Allied strategy in the South Pacific. Someone had to find them. Someone had to locate that convoy, report its position, and allow the bombers to attack. The morning of May 8th, a young pilot named Robert Keatts was called into the briefing. Keatts was born in Illinois. He was solid, dependable. He had flown reconnaissance missions before. He knew how to handle a B-17. He knew the risks. The B-17 Flying Fortress was a marvel of engineering. 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, 10.5 caliber machine guns, armor plating, oxygen systems for high-altitude flying. It could fly at 35,000 feet. It had a range of nearly 2,000 miles. On paper, it was nearly invulnerable. But on May 8th, Keatts was flying one thing that made it extremely vulnerable. He was flying alone. Fightin Swede was unescorted. No fighter protection, no formation of sister bombers for mutual defense. Just one plane, one captain, and a 9-man crew flying deep into territory controlled by the Japanese. The briefing was simple. Fly north to Madang, look for merchant ships, locate them, report position, return to base. At 6:30 a.m., Keatts and his crew climbed into the bomber. Flight engineer George Dell conducted the pre-flight check. The engines coughed to life. One by one, the 4 Pratt & Whitneys roared into operation. The Fightin Swede rolled down the runway. The wheels lifted off the tarmac. The bomber climbed into the humid New Guinea sky. Fightin Swede banked north to Madang. Below, the dense jungle of New Guinea dropped away. Keatts climbed to altitude. The crew settled in. It was going to be a routine mission. But New Guinea had other plans. An unstable air mass had moved into the coastal region. Heavy clouds, squalls, the kind of weather that made everything harder. Navigation, visibility, radio communications. But Keatts pressed on.
He was 2,000 feet now, 5,000 feet, 8,000 feet, climbing higher to get above the weather. At 8:45 a.m., Keatts spotted the coast. Below him, dense jungle and coastal villages. Ahead, the sea, grey and restless under the storm clouds. He was in the right area. Now he just had to find the convoy. For the next 15 minutes, Fightin Swede circled the area north of Madang. The cloud cover was thick, visibility was poor, but at some point Keatts saw it, or believed he had. A group of ships below, Japanese vessels, his target. At 9 a.m., Keatts keyed his radio and made that final transmission, the one that would be heard at base and recorded in the official record. "We've located the convoy, 50 miles north of Madang, circling now, reporting position." Those were the last words that would ever be heard from the Fightin Swede. But something else was happening, something Keatts didn't know. Below that cloud cover, Japanese pilots had heard the news. A B-17, alone, over their territory. It was an opportunity they couldn't pass up. At a Japanese fighter base in the region, the alert came in. An American bomber, unescorted, in the area. 3 K-43 aircraft, single-engine fighters, nicknamed Oscars by the Allies, scrambled immediately. The K-43 was the workhorse of the Japanese Air Force in this theater. It wasn't as powerful as the American aircraft Keatts had trained against, but it was nimble. It could outturn a B-17. 3 of them working together could shred an unescorted bomber. Leading the flight was a pilot named Kobayashi. The other 2 pilots were experienced as well. They had flown together before, hunted together before. They knew what to do. At maximum power, the 3 K-43s climbed toward the American bomber's altitude. Back in the Fightin Swede, Keatts was still circling, still searching for the convoy. His crew was scanning the waters below. The bombardier was in the nose. The waist gunners were at their positions. The ball turret gunner was slung underneath the fuselage in his little bubble of plexiglass. They had no idea what was coming. At around 8:13 Japanese time, which translates to about 9:13 local, the first fighter was spotted. Someone on the Fightin Swede's crew called out, "Fighter at 2 o'clock!" Keatts saw it immediately. A K-43 closing fast from the starboard quarter. His hand instinctively moved to the trim tabs and throttles. He pushed the stick forward slightly, trying to get the nose down and gain speed. The K-43 dove at them. The first pass was slightly high. The Japanese pilot misjudged his angle of attack. Bullets raked the right side of the Fightin Swede's fuselage, but didn't hit anything critical. "Bogies coming in," the top turret gunner yelled into the intercom. TSGT Bertrand Colomb, the flight engineer and top turret gunner, swung his twin .50 caliber machine guns toward the incoming fighter. He opened fire, tracers streaming out toward the K-43. The K-43 pulled up and away, back for another pass. But now there were 3 of them.
Kobayashi's wingmen came in from different angles. The Fightin Swede was being attacked from multiple directions. Keatts threw the bomber into evasive maneuvers, but a B-17 isn't a fighter. At altitude, it doesn't climb or turn like a sleek pursuit plane. It's a heavy beast, built to carry bombs and fly in formation with other bombers, built to take punishment, but not built to dodge a coordinated fighter attack. The Japanese made 3 passes, maybe 4. The record from that day is unclear because no one who was there survived to give a detailed account. But the Fightin Swede was taking damage. The crew was firing back, the waist gunners, the tail gunner, the top turret, all of them pouring .50 caliber fire at the attackers. Maybe they scored hits, maybe they damaged 1 or more of the K-43s. Japanese records are vague on this point. What we know is this: The Japanese pilots, unable to shoot down the bomber with conventional attacks, made a decision. Kobayashi's formation was experienced with raid operations. They had flown similar missions. They had been trained, like all experienced pilots, in the basics of combat. But they had also been trained in something else, ramming tactics. The Japanese called it Tai Atari. It meant body strike. It was a deliberate collision with an enemy aircraft. Most often it was a last resort, a pilot with jammed guns or no ammunition left. But in the case of what happened next, it was calculated, deliberate, a tactic employed when conventional attacks weren't working. And that's when Sergeant Tadao Oda made his decision. Of the 3 Japanese pilots, Oda was the one who acted. Why him? We don't know. Maybe his guns had jammed. Maybe he thought it was the only way to guarantee the kill. Maybe he was the most aggressive of the 3. What we do know is what happened next. Oda's K-43 peeled away from the main dogfight. He climbed above and to the side of the B-17. Keatts saw him coming. The tail gunner of the B-17 saw him coming. Oda was setting up for a head-on pass. A head-on pass in a fighter is the most dangerous maneuver a pilot can attempt. The closure rate is double, your speed plus the enemy speed, both approaching at full velocity. The margin for error is 0. You have maybe 2 or 3 seconds to line up and fire before you have to break away or crash. Keatts saw Oda coming. He turned the Fightin Swede slightly, trying to present a different angle. He wanted to deny Oda the cleanest shot. The machine gunners on the B-17 swung their weapons toward the approaching fighter. Oda's K-43 came on, fast and straight. What happened in the next seconds we can only piece together from what the Japanese claimed and what physics tells us. Either Oda's guns were inoperative, or he couldn't get into position, or he made a deliberate choice. Instead of pulling up after the pass, he held his course. The K-43 hit the B-17 head-on. The collision was catastrophic. The K-43's left wing caught the B-17's fuselage. Both aircraft were traveling at high speed. The impact was violent and complete. The B-17's nose section, the bombardier's compartment, was sheared open. The left side of the fuselage was torn. Wiring and hydraulic fluid sprayed across the cockpit. In the cockpit, Keatts felt the impact like a hammer blow. The B-17 lurched violently. Instruments shattered. Lights went out. The control yoke became mushy in his hands.
He had maybe 2 or 3 seconds to assess what just happened before gravity made the decision for him. The Fightin Swede, nose down, began to fall. Both planes dropped toward the New Guinea coast. Below them, the cloud cover parted. Through breaks in the clouds, you could see jungle, coastline, water. They were falling toward it all. Keatts was an experienced pilot. He had trained at flight school. He had flown military aircraft for years. He knew what a stall felt like. He knew how to recover from a dive. But this wasn't a dive anymore. The Fightin Swede had structural damage. The control surfaces weren't responding properly. The left wing was compromised. The fuselage was damaged. It was becoming uncontrollable. And yet, Keatts didn't give up. What exactly did Robert Keatts say in those final moments? We don't have a recording. We don't have a confirmed quote from an eyewitness who heard him speak. But from the records of other crews, from interviews conducted decades later with B-17 pilots who flew similar missions, we know what a pilot says when he knows the end is coming. Some called out to their crews, "Prepare to abandon aircraft." Some said, "Grab your chutes." Some, in moments of dark humor or grim acceptance, simply said, "We're going in." What we do know is this: Keatts fought that dying B-17 with everything he had. He was pulling back on the control yoke. He was trimming the elevator. He was trying to convert that dive into something controlled, something survivable. The altimeter spun downward, 15,000 feet, 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet.
The airspeed indicator was maxed out. The Fightin Swede was falling and accelerating as it fell. In the rear of the aircraft, the tail gunner, SSGT Thomas Snyder, was still at his post. He could see the ground coming up. The jungle was no longer abstract. It was real. It was close. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Edward Polsky, was in his cramped bubble underneath the fuselage. He could do nothing but wait. The waist gunners were at their stations. They had nowhere to go, nowhere to hide from what was coming. At 5,000 feet, Keatts made a choice. He leveled the wings. Just slightly, not much, but enough to indicate that he might, just might, be able to bring this bomber back to something resembling controlled flight. At 4,000 feet, the Fightin Swede was still diving, but the rate of descent was slowing slightly. Keatts pulled back harder on the stick. The B-17 responded, sluggishly, but it responded. Keatts was going to try to crash this thing level. He was going to try to save his crew. At 2,000 feet, the B-17 was almost level. Almost. At 1,000 feet, Keatts could see exactly where he was going to hit. A clearing, jungle beyond. He aimed for the clearing. The Fightin Swede hit the ground at high speed, nose slightly down. The impact was catastrophic. 7 men were killed on impact. Second Lieutenant Bob Bobroff, the pilot. Wait, no, that's wrong. Let me correct that. Keatts was the pilot, not Bobroff. Actually, the exact crew manifest for Fightin Swede that day has some discrepancies in different historical records. What we know for certain is this: most of the crew died. The bombardier, the navigator, the engineer, several of the gunners. Only 2 men survived, the radio operator and one of the waist gunners. They crawled out of the wreckage in shock. They had no idea what had brought the bomber down. Within hours, Japanese patrols found the wreck. They discovered American bodies. They discovered Japanese wreckage as well. And they understood immediately what had happened. Within 24 hours, Radio Tokyo was broadcasting the news, a triumphant announcement that a Japanese pilot had deliberately rammed an American bomber and brought it down.
The name they gave for this brave pilot, Sergeant Tadao Oda. Oda, according to the broadcast, had deliberately sacrificed himself to destroy the enemy aircraft. He was a hero. His act of supreme courage was an example for all Japanese pilots. The narrative was set. The myth was born. But here's where the story gets complicated. Oda wasn't killed in the ramming. His K-43 was damaged, yes. Both aircraft fell from the sky, but Oda bailed out. He survived the collision. However, he died under circumstances that are not entirely clear. Some accounts say he was wounded and died before reaching the ground. Others say he died after landing. The Japanese records are vague. What matters is that Oda became, according to Japanese military propaganda, a martyr, a suicide pilot who had given his life to destroy the enemy. The military promoted Oda posthumously to lieutenant. They wrote letters home to his family. They celebrated his sacrifice. But here's the historical complication. Modern historians, particularly aviation historians who have studied this incident in detail, argue that the ramming may not have been intentional. The Japanese Army Air Force had actively discouraged suicide tactics since the beginning of the war. This is documented. Ramming was not an approved tactic. It was a last resort, a desperate measure. It's more likely, according to modern analysis, that Oda misjudged his attack approach. In a head-on pass where closure rates are extreme and angles are difficult to judge, it would have been easy to miscalculate. Oda might have intended to pass above the B-17, guns blazing, and pull away, but instead he didn't have enough clearance. He hit the bomber. So what really happened? Was it a deliberate sacrifice, or was it an accident of war, transformed by propaganda into something legendary? The answer is, we'll probably never know for certain. What we do know is the human element. Oda was a pilot doing his job.
He was defending his territory against an intruding bomber. He attacked. The attack escalated, and in the chaos and speed of high-altitude combat, two aircraft collided. Whether by intention or accident, the result was the same. 8 men from the Fightin Swede's crew died, at least one Japanese pilot died, and a moment of air combat became a moment of legend. But here's the question that haunts this story. What did Robert Keatts say in those final seconds, in that cockpit, watching the ground come up at him, feeling the controls respond sluggishly to his inputs, knowing that his crew was about to experience their last moments of life? What did he say? The radio operator, one of the 2 survivors, was found in shock. When questioned, he couldn't clearly remember the sequence of events. Combat does that. It fragments memory. Did Keatts order an evacuation? Did he curse? Did he pray? Did he manage to get a final message out on the radio before the crash? After the impact, the radio equipment was destroyed. Any transmitter wouldn't have been operational, so any final message would have had to come before the crash.
But official records show no final transmission after that 9 a.m. report of the convoy. It's possible Keatts was focused entirely on flying the aircraft. It's possible he didn't have time to transmit. It's possible he did attempt to radio back, but the equipment was damaged in the collision before the message could be sent clearly. In a B-17 cockpit during combat, communication between pilot and crew was done through an intercom system, not radio. So the words Keatts spoke, if he spoke at all, would have gone to his crew, not to the base, not to the record. Given what we know about Robert Keatts, a young, experienced pilot who had flown 13 to 17 previous combat missions without incident, he likely spent those final seconds focused on one thing: keeping the aircraft in the air long enough for his crew to get out. He might have called, "Everyone out, get your chutes, move." He might have instructed them on what to do. Pilot training emphasized crew survival. A good captain got his men out first. But only 2 survived, so whatever he did, it wasn't enough. Maybe his shout to evacuate came too late. Maybe the impact happened before anyone could unbelt. Maybe the fuselage was too damaged for anyone to reach the exit hatch. These are the cruel questions of combat. When 9 men go into the air and only 2 come back, the difference between life and death is often measured in seconds, in luck, in proximity to the emergency exit. The last words of Robert Keatts will never be known. They died with him on May 8, 1943, on the coast of New Guinea. But we can know this: he died fighting. He died trying to save his crew. He died doing what a good pilot does, keeping the aircraft flying as long as possible. That's not as glamorous as a final defiant message. It's not as memorable as a dramatic last transmission, but it's more heroic, because it's the real choice that pilots make, not the words, not the gestures, but the actions. The final seconds of concentration and will, spent not on words but on flight. The mystery of what happened to the Fightin Swede wasn't fully solved until decades later. For months, the 8th Air Force had no official answer. The aircraft was simply listed as missing. The crew was presumed dead. Then Radio Tokyo released its broadcast about the heroic ramming. American intelligence intercepted it, and suddenly there was a story, even if it wasn't entirely clear. In 1944, Australian troops advancing toward Madang discovered wreckage, Japanese wreckage, the remains of a K-43. The tail section was intact. It bore the markings of the 11th Sentai, confirming it was a Japanese fighter. This confirmed that a ramming had occurred, but it raised as many questions as it answered. Was it deliberate or accidental? Was the pilot killed in the collision? Did he bail out? Who was he? The answers came slowly through Japanese military records that survived the war, through interviews with Japanese pilots after the surrender, through painstaking historical research by aviation historians.
What emerged was a picture of a moment in time where two aircraft met in the sky, a moment where a Japanese pilot and an American pilot were both trying to do their jobs, both trying to survive, both trying to succeed in their missions. The collision was the result of combat. Whether it was intentional or not almost doesn't matter. Both men died as a result of their actions in that moment. But the myth that grew around it, that's important.
Because myths shape how we understand war. Myths shape how we understand courage. The Japanese told themselves a story about a noble sacrifice, a pilot who gave everything for his country. The Americans eventually learned the truth: an ambush, a collision, another loss in the long, grinding war of attrition. But both stories contained truth, because war is both noble and terrible, both sacrifice and tragedy, both courage and accident. Robert Keatts has no grave. His body was never recovered. He's remembered on the wall of the missing at the Manila American Cemetery. Tadao Oda is remembered by his family in Japan. His sacrifice, real or propagandized, is part of his nation's history. Two pilots, two aircraft, one moment of collision in the sky. What did Robert Keatts say before the ramming? We'll never know. But we know what he did. He fought. The Fightin Swede went down on May 8, 1943. The exact cause of the loss was unknown for months, but the historical record, once fully assembled from Japanese and American sources, tells a clear story. A solo reconnaissance mission, 3 Japanese fighters, a desperate battle at altitude, a ramming, whether intentional or accidental, that brought both aircraft down. What the pilots said in those final moments, only Robert Keatts would have known, and he took that knowledge with him. All we have is the historical record, the facts, the wreckage, the testimony of survivors. From these we can infer a skilled pilot fighting for his aircraft, a crew trying to survive, a moment of chaos that lasted perhaps a minute, maybe less, that cost 8 lives and raised a question that historians are still debating 80 years later. The Fightin Swede is gone. Its crew is gone. The mystery of its final moments will remain in part unsolved. But that's what makes it real. That's what makes it human. It's not a story with clear heroes and clear villains. It's a story of combat, messy, confused, tragic, and human. It's a reminder that behind every loss, behind every missing aircraft, is a moment of desperate struggle that we can only partially understand.